I slept in a forgotten signal house. A widow. There said, the bank sends someone every month now. Nora Fenwick had $10, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a railroad signal maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any trackside structure she passed for shelter. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten building that kept her fed and dry for a few weeks at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 8 months earlier when the Regional Rail Authority automated its remaining signal systems and eliminated the maintenance positions that had once kept a human technician assigned to each rural stretch of line. She had been moving through rail towns ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The automation notice had cited modernization efficiencies as its justification, language Nora had come to recognize across 8 months of towns exactly like this one as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a particular stretch of track mattered less than whatever centralized system could theoretically monitor the same signals from a distance instead. She had grown up the daughter of a signal maintainer herself, riding along on inspection walks from an early age, learning the particular patience such work required, the willingness to check a mechanism thoroughly rather than trust it simply because it had worked correctly the day before. She found the old signal house at dusk on a cool evening in early autumn, a small clapboard structure standing beside a disused spur line, its windows dark but its chimney showing a faint wisp of smoke that suggested, despite the building's evident age and neglect, someone still called it home. Nora knocked at the door rather than simply letting herself in, understanding from the smoke that she wasn't looking at an abandoned structure after all. An elderly woman answered, studying Nora with the particular wary tiredness of someone who had grown accustomed to unwelcome visitors arriving at odd hours. "You're not from the bank," the woman said, more statement than question, relief evident in her voice once she'd looked Nora over properly. "I'm sorry. I've grown jumpy about visitors lately. Name's Opal Ferris. This signal house was my husband's post for 30 years before the railroad automated the line and let him go. We've lived here ever since, though I suppose I should say I've lived here alone, these past 4 years since he passed." "I didn't mean to startle you," Nora said. "I saw smoke and thought I'd ask rather than assume the place was empty. I'm looking for somewhere to shelter for the night, if you don't mind a stranger nearby." "I don't mind at all," Opal said. "I could use the company more than you probably realize. Come in out of the cold, and I'll explain why I mistook you for someone considerably less welcome." Over the following hour, Opal told Nora, in a voice that carried more exhaustion than fear, exactly why she'd grown so wary of unexpected visitors arriving at her door. Her husband, Walter, had purchased the signal house and its small surrounding parcel from the railroad decades earlier, when the company decided to sell off several remote maintenance structures rather than continue maintaining them directly, financing the modest purchase through a small loan from the railroad's own employee credit union. Walter had paid off that loan years before his death, or so Opal had always believed, but in the 4 years since his passing, a bank that had apparently acquired the credit union's old loan portfolio during some regional consolidation had begun sending a representative to the signal house nearly every month, insisting the loan remained outstanding and demanding payment on a balance that, with accumulated interest and fees, now considerably exceeded what Walter had originally borrowed. The first visit, I simply thought it was some kind of mistake that would sort itself out, Opal said. By the 3rd month, I understood it wasn't going to sort itself out on its own. By the 6th, I'd started dreading the calendar itself, watching the days count down toward whatever date they'd chosen to arrive that particular month. I stopped answering the phone most days, stopped opening mail promptly, simply because I never knew when the next reminder of it might arrive. "That sounds exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the actual money," Nora said. It was, Opal said. I don't think I fully understood until you asked just now how much of my daily life had reorganized itself around simply surviving that dread. Month after month, with no end in sight and no proof in hand that I wasn't somehow genuinely at fault for a debt I couldn't disprove. I don't have any record of the loan being paid off, Opal admitted. Walter always handled our finances, and after he passed, I simply assumed the house was fully ours, the way he'd always told me it would be by the time he retired. I don't have the paperwork to prove otherwise, and the bank's representative comes every month now, more insistent each time, telling me the balance grows larger the longer I go without paying it. Has anyone from the bank shown you documentation of the original loan terms or evidence that payments actually stopped at some point? Nora asked. Just a printout, listing a balance and a series of dates, Opal said. I don't understand banking records well enough to know whether what they're showing me is accurate or not. I only know the visits have become the worst part of my month. Every month, for the better part of a year now. I've started losing sleep the week before, wondering what new figure they'll quote me, wondering whether this will finally be the visit where they mention losing the house outright. Has anyone actually threatened foreclosure directly? Nora asked. Not in so many words, Opal said. But the representative always mentions, toward the end of each visit, that the bank has options available if the balance isn't addressed soon. I've understood that as a threat, whether or not he's ever used that particular word. Nora spent the following days doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She made herself useful around the Signal House's more immediate needs, understanding that whatever the truth of the loan situation turned out to be, Opal deserved better company through it than she'd apparently had in the 4 years since Walter's death. The Signal House's own wiring, some of it dating back to the building's original construction, showed clear signs of wear that concerned Nora considerably, and she spent several days carefully replacing the worst sections, working with the same patient attention she'd once brought to her actual signal maintenance job before the automation notice ended it. She traced each circuit methodically before touching anything, understanding that old wiring in a structure this age could hide surprises a less careful technician might miss entirely, and found, in the process, an old junction box behind the kitchen wall that hadn't been properly inspected in years. Its connections corroded enough that she suspected it had been a fire risk long before either of them had thought to check it. She also repaired a section of the roof where age had let water begin seeping into the small back bedroom, replacing rotted decking and resealing the flashing around the chimney, and fixed a wood stove flue that had been drawing poorly for what Opal admitted had likely been years, clearing a nest of debris that had accumulated undisturbed since long before Walter's death. Walter always kept this place in better condition than I've managed alone, Opal told her one afternoon, watching Nora work. I've done what I could, but there's only so much an old woman can manage by herself, especially once dread of the bank's next visit starts eating into whatever energy she has left for anything else. You've managed more than you're giving yourself credit for, Nora said. This structure stood 30 extra years past its working life because somebody cared enough to keep patching what needed patching, even without a husband's help. That's not nothing, whatever exhaustion you felt doing it. It was while helping Opal search through Walter's old belongings, looking for any record that might clarify the loan's actual status, that Nora found a small metal box tucked into the back of a closet shelf, containing decades of financial paperwork Opal admitted she'd never had the heart to sort through properly after his death. I kept meaning to go through it, Opal said, setting the box on the kitchen table with hands that hesitated before finally releasing it. Every time I opened this closet, I told myself I'd deal with it next week, and next week became next year, and eventually 4 years had passed, and I'd simply stopped opening the closet at all if I could help it. Grief has a way of making ordinary tasks feel considerably larger than they are, Nora said. I don't think there's anything wrong with taking 4 years to open a box that reminds you of everything you've lost. They worked through the box together over several evenings, Opal narrating fragments of memory attached to receipts and old letters as they surfaced. The particular slow excavation of a marriage's financial history, neither of them had expected to become quite so personal an undertaking. There were receipts from a used truck Walter had bought the year they married, a stack of birthday cards Opal had apparently saved rather than the financial documents she'd been searching for, and finally, near the bottom of the box, the folder containing the credit union correspondence Nora had been hoping to find. Among the papers was a formal letter from the Railroad Credit Union itself, dated nearly 15 years before Walter's death, confirming the loan's final payment had been received and the account formally closed and satisfied in full. The letter included a payoff statement showing a zero balance, along with the credit union's own seal, and an authorized signature confirming the debt no longer existed in any form. Opal held the letter for a long moment before speaking, her eyes wet but her voice steady. 15 years, and this has been sitting in a box in my own closet the entire time, she said. I could have ended this a year ago, the very first month that man showed up at my door, if I'd only had the courage to open this box sooner. You have it now, Nora said gently. That's what actually matters. Whatever the delay cost you and worry along the way, this settles it, Nora added, reading the letter twice to be certain she understood its full significance. Whatever the bank's showing you on that printout, this letter proves the original loan was paid off in full 15 years ago. Any balance they're claiming now either reflects a records error on their end or something considerably less innocent. I don't understand how a bank could simply invent a debt that doesn't exist. Opal said. I don't think they invented it exactly, Nora said. I think it's more likely the credit union's records were never properly updated when this bank acquired their loan portfolio, and whoever's managing collections on their end is simply working from an incomplete file that shows the loan as active because nobody ever closed it out in their own system. Whatever the actual payoff proves happened years ago. The bank's representative, a tired-looking man named Dennis Hartley, who Opal explained had been making these monthly visits for nearly a year, arrived at the Signal House 3 days later, carrying the same familiar folder Opal described. He looked, Nora thought, considerably less like a threat and considerably more like a man worn down by a job he'd stopped enjoying long before that particular afternoon, his shoulders carrying the specific slump of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had never quite made peace with it. Mrs. Ferris, Hartley said, I understand this is a difficult conversation to keep having, but the account remains delinquent. I'd like to discuss a payment plan today, rather than let this continue accumulating further. I have documentation showing this loan was paid in full 15 years ago, Opal said, producing the letter herself, with a steadiness Nora hadn't heard in her voice during any of their previous conversations about the bank's visits. I'd like you to explain why your records show otherwise, given this formal payoff confirmation from the original credit union. Hartley studied the letter for a long moment, his tired expression shifting into something more genuinely troubled, and Nora watched him read it twice, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the credit union's formal language. I've never seen this document before, he said finally. My file simply shows an active balance transferred from the credit union's portfolio during the acquisition. I don't have any record indicating it had already been satisfied prior to that transfer. How does an account with a zero balance end up transferred as an active debt? Nora asked. I don't know, Hartley admitted, and something in his honesty struck Nora as considerably more genuine than she'd expected from a debt collector caught in an uncomfortable position. I've asked that question myself more than once about accounts that never quite made sense to me. Nobody above me has ever had a satisfying answer beyond telling me to keep working the file as assigned. Opal, once Hartley had gone, mentioned that she intended to have the letter formally reviewed by an attorney regardless. Wanting to be certain the bank couldn't simply resume its visits the following month if their internal review somehow found a way to dismiss the payoff letter's significance. A local legal aid attorney named Foster Cray, whose name Nora recognized from stories she'd heard traveling through other rural counties, agreed to review the documentation and formally notify the bank of Opal's position, adding a layer of legal weight to what had, until then, existed only as a conversation between Opal and a single sympathetic representative. Cray's office, a modest storefront practice specializing in exactly this kind of rural consumer protection case, reviewed the payoff letter alongside the credit union's original loan agreement, cross-referencing dates and signatures with the particular thoroughness of someone who had seen enough transferred debt errors over the years to know precisely what documentation actually settled a dispute versus what merely delayed it. "This letter is about as clean as documentation gets in a case like this," Cray told them, reviewing the payoff statement with evident satisfaction. "I'll send formal notice today. I don't expect the bank's own internal review to find anything different from what we've already established. But I'd rather you have a paper trail of your own now, matching theirs, so there's no ambiguity about when this matter was properly resolved." "Then I'd think your bank owes Mrs. Ferris both an apology and a corrected record," Nora said, "rather than another year of monthly visits demanding payment on a debt that's been settled for a decade and a half." Hartley took a photograph of the letter with his phone, his hands not quite steady, and told Opal, with evident discomfort at his own company's apparent error, that he would escalate the matter formally rather than continue the monthly visits pending a full review. "I've had a bad feeling about this particular account for months," he admitted before leaving. "The numbers never quite made sense to me, the way they compounded. I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to actually check the original file properly. I don't enjoy this part of my job, Mrs. Ferris. I want you to know that, whatever else you think of me after a year of these visits." The bank's formal review, completed within the following month, confirmed the credit union's payoff letter as authentic and the current claimed balance as an error stemming from an incomplete data transfer during the original acquisition. One of apparently several similar errors the bank's own internal audit subsequently uncovered across a handful of other transferred accounts. Hartley called the Signal House himself once the review concluded, a courtesy Nora understood was likely well beyond his usual job duties. "I wanted to tell you directly, rather than just let a form letter arrive without any explanation attached to it," he said. The audit found 4 other accounts with similar transfer errors, all involving elderly customers whose original credit union records simply never made it properly into the new system. I don't know how many months of unnecessary visits some of them endured before anyone thought to check as carefully as you did. "What happens to those other accounts now?" Opal asked. "The bank's issuing corrections and formal apologies to all of them," Hartley said. "I made certain of that myself, once I understood the scope of what your letter had actually uncovered. I don't think I'd have pushed the audit as hard as I did if I hadn't stood in your kitchen and watched you produce proof I should have thought to ask for a year ago myself." "How many months had those other families been visited before this?" Nora asked. "Some considerably longer than a year," Hartley admitted. One elderly gentleman 2 counties over had been dealing with the same kind of monthly visit for nearly 18 months before the audit caught his account. I understand he's since received the same apology and correction Mrs. Ferris is about to receive. I only wish it hadn't taken this particular case to finally force the review that should have happened the moment the accounts were transferred in the first place." Opal received a formal letter of apology from the bank's regional office within the following weeks, along with confirmation that the account was permanently closed and marked satisfied, a resolution that arrived nearly a year to the day after Dennis Hartley's very first monthly visit had begun. I don't know how to describe what it feels like after a year of dreading the calendar to simply not have to think about it anymore. Opal told Nora, once the bank's confirmation letter had arrived. I'd nearly convinced myself I was losing my mind, unable to find proof of something I remembered Walter telling me was settled years ago. You weren't losing your mind, Nora said. You were simply missing one piece of paper that happened to be sitting in a box nobody had opened in years. I'm glad we finally opened it. Nora stayed on at the Signal House through that winter and the ones that followed. The small structure that had first given her an evening shelter becoming, gradually, something closer to a shared home than either of them had expected when a stranger first knocked on the door rather than simply walking past. She continued the wiring and structural repairs she'd begun that first autumn, working through the Signal House's remaining needs one careful project at a time over the following year, understanding with each repair that she was restoring not just a building, but the last physical trace of Walter's own 30 years of careful, patient work, maintaining the same structure for the railroad before automation ended that particular chapter of his life. Opal taught her, in turn, the specific history of the line itself. The trains that had once run through here regularly enough that Walter's signals mattered to dozens of crews a week. A history Nora found herself absorbing with the same hungry attention she'd once brought to her own father's service calls as a child. Nora learned, over that first year, the particular satisfaction of watching a structure regain its former soundness, one careful repair at a time, work considerably different from the isolated maintenance calls she'd once made as a signal technician, where a job finished cleanly and moved on rather than unfolding slowly across an entire season of patient attention to the same building. Opal, in turn, found herself, by that first spring, sleeping through full nights again for the first time in years, no longer startled awake by every unfamiliar sound outside, and told Nora more than once that the change had less to do with the resolved debt itself than with simply no longer facing each new day entirely alone. Walter would have been glad to know somebody finally checked that old box properly, Opal told her one evening, the two of them sitting together beside the newly repaired wood stove. He always said a paper trail was worth keeping precisely because you never knew which piece of it might matter most, years after you'd stopped thinking about it. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the paperwork, Nora said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face a year of monthly dread entirely alone, whatever the eventual outcome turned out to be. I didn't expect at my age to find myself grateful for a stranger's knock at my door instead of frightened by it, Opal said. But I am, considerably more than I know how to properly express. You gave an old woman's 4 years of quiet grief the kind of company it always deserved, and never had, until a signal technician happened to need shelter on exactly the right cold evening. I think I noticed that smoke rising from your chimney because some part of me was looking for exactly this kind of place, Nora said. Somewhere somebody had kept a fire burning long after anyone official required it. I didn't know I was looking for that until I found it standing beside a spur line nobody uses anymore. Then I suppose we found each other at exactly the right moment, Opal said. Whatever a bank's own carelessness nearly cost us both before we did. Nora wrote to her own mother that winter, describing the Signal House and the bank's error and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine shelter search to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the automation notice ended her own signal maintenance career. Her mother's reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Nora remembered growing up with. Your father always said the whole point of careful maintenance work was making certain small problems got caught before they became large ones, whether that problem was a worn signal relay or a bank's own sloppy record-keeping. Sounds like you found your way back to exactly that kind of work, and exactly the person who needed you to notice what everyone else had overlooked. Opal kept the credit union's payoff letter framed on the Signal House wall after that, alongside a photograph of Walter in his own working uniform, A small but permanent reminder of exactly what had nearly been lost and exactly what had finally protected it. Hartley, for his part, stopped by the Signal House once more that following spring, not on official business, but simply to see, he explained, how Opal was managing since the matter's resolution. A visit that struck both women as considerably more meaningful than anything his monthly folder had ever produced. "I don't often get the chance to see how a case actually resolves," Hartley told them, standing in the same kitchen where he'd once delivered a year of unwelcome news. "I'm glad this one ended the way it did. I don't think I'll forget it any time soon." He looked around the small, warm kitchen a moment longer before speaking again. "I put in for a transfer to a different department last month. Collections work never sat right with me the way it should have, and this case made that considerably harder to keep ignoring. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many old debts, long since settled, get quietly resurrected by an institution's own incomplete records, terrorizing someone who has no way of proving a negative without the exact piece of paper that happens to prove it? And what does it take? A stranger who knocked instead of assuming, a box left unopened in a closet for years, a bank finally willing to check its own file properly, for a year of monthly dread to finally come to an end. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.